Bene. Buongiorno a tutti, sono molto contento di avere l'occasione di presentare il nostro ospite che è Farhad Dalal, uno dei più importanti group analisti della Group Analysis Society di Londra. Questo evento è ospitato dalla Scuola di Psicoterapia Analitica di Gruppo, Nuova Clinica e Nuovi Setting, di cui io sono il rappresentante legale. Dopo avervi detto due parole sulla scuola e su questo evento, lascerò la parola appunto al direttore della scuola, il dottor Riccardo Marco Scognamiglio. Per il momento vi voglio anticipare soltanto che si tratta di un evento che abbiamo programmato nel tempo e che questa condizione di pandemia che affligge tutti quanti noi comunque ci sta dando l'occasione di sviluppare online per la nota accettazione che gli eventi online hanno avuto in questo ultimo periodo di tempo. Allora, sono molto lieto di presentare Farhad Dalal, che come molti di voi sapranno, appunto è uno dei group analisti più noti della Group Analysis Society e che lavora privatamente a Devon, come ci ha detto anche poco fa, da molti anni, oltre 20 anni, e che si sta avviando rapidamente a incrementare un'attività anche di formazione in India, che credo sia un paese a cui lui è molto legato come origine. Farhad ha scritto innumerevoli articoli interessantissimi e anche dei libri che fanno parte ormai della biblioteca di tutti i gruppi analisti, anche qui italiani. Il primo di questi, lo voglio ricordare, è Prendere il gruppo sul serio, che io ho letto, credo che sia uscito in Inghilterra nel 1998 e poi qui in Italia nel 2002 ad opera della Raffaello Cortina Editori, e che è un libro mirabile secondo me perché modernizza, in qualche modo oppone delle domande di modernizzazione a quello che è il pensiero di Fulks, al quale tutti noi facciamo riferimento. Pone degli interrogativi, alcuni dei quali stanno trovando risposta, altri ancora non hanno trovata, ma sicuramente illumina e stimola la riflessione nel campo gruppo analitico, collegando tra l'altro il pensiero analitico in sé col pensiero sociologico di Elias, nell'ambito sempre della gruppo analisi. Poi ha scritto altri libri sul razzismo e adesso credo che si stia interessando da qualche tempo al concetto principale della supervisione e dell'etica nella supervisione, in particolare nell'ambito dell'esperienza formativa. Ed infatti oggi noi l'abbiamo invitato a tenere questo seminario, questo webinar online, in cui l'argomento è proprio l'etica della supervisione nella formazione in gruppo analisi. Quindi per quanto riguarda la modalità con cui si svolgerà questo evento, avremo dopo che Riccardo avrà detto alcune cose sulla scuola, avremo naturalmente l'esperienza di Farhad, che ci porterà in un'ora circa del suo lavoro. Seguirà uno spazio per le domande e gli interventi contenuti in una mezz'ora, quindi ci sarà un large group e alla conclusione di questo large group, a cui potranno naturalmente partecipare tutti quanti, large group che sarà condotto dai nostri colleghi Marina Brinchi e Sandro Papale, alla fine del large group ci saranno un altro breve periodo per le conclusioni. A questo punto io lascio la parola a Riccardo, dopodiché la riprenderò per introdurre Farhad. Prego Riccardo.
Grazie mille, cercherò di essere brevissimo. Il mio compito vorrebbe essere quello di dare il benvenuto a tutti i partecipanti a questo Open Day della scuola Nuova Clinica Nuovi Setting e quindi dare due dritte su come abbiamo concepito questo tipo di esperienza. Allora, sono molto orgoglioso di avere come ospite un ospite così illustre e con un tema così specifico, no? Così tecnico, che riguarda un aspetto veramente cruciale della formazione del terapeuta oggi. E mi viene da citare Jacques Lacan, che diceva non c'è tecnica senza etica. No? E quindi mi ha colpito molto questa centralità del focus dell'intervento di Farhad sull'etica, no? Anche nella supervisione. Etica che riguarda la delicatezza di trattare un materiale umano, no? Che sfugge alla dimensione prettamente numerica, per esempio dell'evidence based. E su questo vorrei dire anche che la nostra scuola è particolarmente interessata effettivamente a fare riflessioni su tutto quello che comporta questo mestiere impossibile. Il mestiere impossibile è un modo in cui Freud parlava della psicoanalisi, no? E della sua evoluzione. È molto attenta la nostra scuola a pensare a come oggi significhi questo mestiere impossibile fare qualche cosa di un incontro con l'altro, no? Un incontro come base fondamentale di un processo di trasformazione. Allora osserviamo che effettivamente la psicoanalisi nasce con una grande attenzione sul mondo interno, su ciò che accadeva all'interno dell'apparato psichico e nel processo dell'evoluzione storica di questo secolo siamo sempre più dovuti andare a interrogare che cosa accadeva all'esterno di questo mondo psichico e a studiarne le interazioni. Per cui penso che il concetto di gruppo al centro del nostro processo di formazione nella scuola, nuove cliniche, nuovi setting, sia una esigenza etica anzitutto, perché noi viviamo in una dimensione sociale. Freud probabilmente, che ha pure avuto tutta una serie di intuizioni sugli aspetti della socializzazione, dell'altro, dell'influenza della società sulla dimensione intrapsichica, però era fortemente concentrato sul modello che stava prendendo forma a quell'epoca. Però da Freud in poi l'urgenza di confrontarsi con ciò che accade all'esterno è stata assolutamente cruciale. Oggi anche nell'ambito psicodinamico la nostra scuola si interessa assolutamente ai modelli interpersonali e relazionali e la Group Analysis credo che sia proprio un'amplificazione, un'estensione di questo e ci permette anche di sperimentare in tutte le sue dimensioni, non solo nell'ambito clinico e psicoterapeutico, che cosa possa significare essere sempre con l'altro. No? Non esiste un apparato psichico da solo, siamo sempre con l'altro. Quindi direi che i 3 elementi chiave con cui noi abbiamo costruito questo progetto di scuola, che è una scuola molto giovane, ha 3 anni di vita ed è una scuola già molto strutturata, no? Con una grossa partecipazione, è anzitutto interrogare questa inevitabilità del sociale in relazione all'individuo e quindi non un individuo pensato da solo, ma un individuo sempre pensato con l'altro. Quindi i modelli della psicoanalisi, così come si sono evoluti sia all'interno del modello individuale che del modello gruppo analitico. La dimensione appunto gruppo analitica nelle sue più disparate sfaccettature e tutto questo letto all'insegna della contemporaneità. Cioè che cosa siamo noi oggi come esseri sociali e come leggere il malessere dell'oggi come esseri sociali. Una società che cambia drasticamente e siamo in una fase dove la pandemia sicuramente ha dato una marca di trasformazione radicale di questo essere sociale. E il terzo punto fondamentale della nostra scuola è l'esigenza di fare cultura della clinica. Ecco perché siamo qua oggi con un ospite così importante, abbiamo avuto altri appuntamenti e altri ne avremo a breve, il prossimo mese avremo altri incontri con altri ospiti importanti perché crediamo molto che sia necessario non solo fare didattica, ma anche fare dibattito, anche incontrarsi fra colleghi a ragionare sulle esigenze attuali della clinica. Per cui io nuovamente ringrazio Farhad Dalal di essere qui fra noi e ringrazio tutti voi che siete qua a condividere questo momento. Il large group è una modalità di lavoro importante della Group Analysis in cui ci si ritrova anche nel silenzio a riflettere, a metabolizzare un'esperienza, quindi degli input, delle sollecitazioni che abbiamo ricevuto in precedenza e io invito tutti a continuare nel large group e a sperimentare anche questa esperienza del possibile, il possibile dell'espressione, il possibile dell'interiorizzazione. E invito a proseguire con noi in questi appuntamenti di cultura della clinica che sono per noi veramente essenziali. Grazie, buon lavoro.
Allora lascio la parola a Farhad e buon lavoro. Grazie, ti ascoltiamo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me here. Maybe I should just say a little bit about where I'm at. For many years, I've been thinking about the power and power relations and the social. So I had this understanding that psychotherapy had decoupled itself from politics. Politics was somehow outside psychotherapy. And then since then, I've also come to understand that psychotherapy has also decoupled itself from ethics, because it thinks of itself as a science, and the science is supposedly outside politics and outside ethics. So it was with my 𝐤𝐸𝐶𝐥𝐥𝐸𝐿 lecture, I started this journey. And so I'm writing, this is the area I'm thinking about just now, ethics. And also to say that this training we've started in India is also now 3 years old, like yours. And one of the things of importance to me is that we don't run this training like another colonial project. People from Britain going to India and educating the Indians in the way of the world. Now, so I'm trying to, in Britain anyway, that there are a few people who start talking about decolonizing the curriculum. And so I think of this, that principle to be at the heart of this training we're trying to do. And this paper speaks a little bit into that. Okay, so just to frame the talk. And so let me start by asking the question, in what sort of situation is the subject of ethics even relevant? And I'll start with an area where it seems to have no relevance when it comes to mechanical objects like carburetors and pistons. Here, the ideas of good and bad ethics seem to have little to do with the workings of these actual mechanisms. Instead, what will be important here are notions of outcome and efficiency, whether something is working or not. But ethics comes into its own regarding the way that these objects are used. For example, not driving when drunk, or not using an electric drill at 3 o'clock in the morning when everybody's asleep. You could say that the ethical sensibility modulates interactions between people. And the ethical sensibility enables me to take account of the presence of others and modulate my thoughts, feelings, and actions accordingly. But anyway, here was one area where it's just mechanisms, and it seems ethics has nothing to do with it. So if I move a little bit along the spectrum to the activity of science, where there's a person called a scientist who's studying something inanimate, like the structure of carbon, say. So now the ethics of science require the scientist to be neutral and detached and not invested in any particular outcome. Their task is the disinterested and dispassionate pursuit of truth, wherever it may lead. And so they have to keep themselves and their desires out of the picture, because these will cloud their objectivity and lead them astray. So in effect, natural scientists are obliged to bracket off large swathes of what makes persons human, in order to limit themselves to only their rational faculties. So another step along the spectrum now, what are the ethical requirements of scientists working directly on the bodies of human beings? For example, medical surgeons. So their ethical responsibility requires them to be knowledgeable about the mechanics of the body and the bit that they specialize in, and they're ethically required to become as proficient as possible in the use of certain techniques, that they should approach each operation in a sober way, and they should do their best to succeed. This would be the, if you like, the ethics of a medical surgeon. However, it's also the case that in order to do their job, whilst performing the actual operation, the surgeon mostly cannot afford to keep in mind that it is a suffering human being that he or she is cutting open, say a mother of 2 children. So a particular person is dehumanized by reducing them into a problem. Patient number 6 with a collapsed 3rd vertebrate. Now, I have some sympathy with the surgeon and forgive them this kind of dehumanization, because it is in the interest of the person being operated on. It is a way of stopping the surgeon's heart getting in the way of their hands, as a way of putting it. But now this puts me and the surgeon at odds with Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, who made the strong distinction between rational beings, humans, and the rest of the universe, mechanisms. And he said that not only was it incorrect, it was unethical to treat human beings as things, as mechanisms. And he said it's incorrect because mechanisms are predictable and humans are not. Humans are unpredictable because they have free will due to their capacity for rational thought. Human beings decide how to respond, which makes them not only unpredictable, but also moral beings who are responsible for their choices and actions. So that's why it's wrong. But dehumanization is unethical because it renders humans into things. And for Kant, to treat humans as things, as commodities, to use them as a means to an end, all of this, according to Kant, is morally wrong. So now, coming further on the spectrum, I come finally to psychotherapy and ask, what kind of activity is psychotherapy? If it is a scientific activity, as many claim it to be, then the ethics of the psychotherapist should be something like that of the natural scientist, neutral and detached. The person coming for treatment becomes the object that is being studied, an object called patient. In this way, persons are turned into things that need help, but things nevertheless. And there are 2 kinds of therapists who think this to be the case. The first are those who think of themselves as analysts of the classical kind, who think of themselves as delivering treatments which consist of analyzing clinical phenomena almost entirely through the lenses of transference and countertransference. In other words, with everything taking place being read as a response to the analyst. I should say here that there are other varieties of analyst, relational ones, whom I'll come to later. So to the classical analyst, all deviations into other forms of engagement are thought to be some kind of acting out, some kind of technical error being drawn in and becoming over-involved. And although classical psychoanalysis deals in emotions, paradoxically, these analysts claim to be able to do so dispassionately. Moreover, the emotions that the classical analysts themselves experience, they attribute to being caused by the patient, either because of the patient projecting their emotions into the analyst or because of countertransference, this being the response of the analyst also being caused by the patient. Most importantly, the classical analyst is required to deal with both of them from the vantage point of dispassionate detachment. And certainly in Britain, many a group analyst has signed up to this viewpoint. The second kind of therapist who think that their treatments are scientific are practitioners of the so-called evidence-based therapies. They claim to follow protocols that have been scientifically tested and proved to work. And based on this empirical evidence, these protocols are manualized. And because scientific knowledge is necessarily predictable and repeatable, all practitioners have to do is to follow the instructions written into their treatment manuals. In this way, cognitivists, much more so than classical analysts, have turned humans into mechanisms that are amenable to be modified by the principles of cause and effect. If I do this, then that will necessarily follow. And I should say as an aside that their claims that they are evidence-based therapies are false, which is primarily what my last book was about. So in sum, if psychotherapy is a scientific treatment, then the ethics of the practitioner should be something like that of the natural scientist, detached and dispassionate. Now, shortly after qualifying from the Institute of Group Analysis in London in 1991, I started having supervision from a psychoanalyst based at the Tavistock Clinic in London. Now, given that I just completed a group analytic training, why did I decide to choose to be supervised by a psychoanalyst rather than a group analyst? Well, on reflection, there were two reasons. First, at that time, the late 1980s, my group analytic training had made little distinction between group analysis and psychoanalysis. And second, in the cultural hierarchy of the psychotherapies that I was immersed in London, psychoanalysis was at the very top of the status tree. Psychoanalysis had a certain kind of allure that group analysis did not. So much so that psychoanalysis claimed to be, and still claims to be, a different kind of activity from that of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is an activity which tries to make people better. But psychoanalysis makes it a point of not trying to make people better. Because in order to do, if you set out with that intention, you would be breaking the scientific paradigm. The scientific paradigm is that I should not be invested in the outcome. So, like natural scientists, psychoanalysts are engaged, or these kinds of psychoanalysts are engaged in the dispassionate pursuit of truth, wherever it may lead. The self-knowledge gained by the patient through the treatment process might or might not result in them becoming more fulfilled in their lives, but that was not the purpose of the treatment. Now, the form of treatment, of supervision with this psychoanalyst that I'm about to speak about mirrored this detached ethos of the classical psychoanalytic endeavor. Each session, I would bring my notes consisting of my recollections of the therapy session as close to verbatim as I could manage. The first part of each supervision consisted of me reading out my notes from my notebook. And whilst I read these out, the supervisor wrote down what I was reading into his notebook. And about 2/3 of the way through the 15-minute session, he would then tell me what had really been taking place in my therapy session. This I duly and dutifully wrote down in my notebook. The process was entirely formal. He addressed me as Mr. Dalal, and I understood that I was to address him as Mr. X. He thought that patients were to be similarly addressed in this formal manner, because to use first name terms, first names suggested a promise of intimacy, he thought, that was both seductive and beguiling. He did finally allow persons and groups to be called by first names because of confidentiality. Anyhow, looking back, there was nothing dialogical about our interaction. There was nothing conversational. Supervision, no less than psychotherapy, was taken to be a kind of scientific process. I brought data, my notes, which the dispassionate supervisor analyzed and interpreted. And the supervisor's observations were mostly delivered as statements of objective facts. Facts, by their nature, are truths. The alternative is falsehood. And some of these moments from many years ago have stayed with me over the years. On one occasion, when I said something about a particular patient acting like a 𝐝𝐞𝐥𝐿 baby, he responded, "Why say 𝐝𝐞𝐥𝐿 baby? Why not just baby?" In other words, babies were as Klein described them to me. This was a fact. There could be no possibility of a Winnicottian baby, for example. Once, after reporting on a session that I thought went well, he pronounced, "Unfortunately, you went wrong after the first 10 minutes. On another occasion, when I reported asking the patient, "What do you feel right now?" the supervisor said that it would have been better if I had asked, "What are you thinking right now?" Statements of this kind, repeated over the years, were in effect inducting me into a worldview that privileged thought over emotion. I recall him telling me once that there was no point in asking the patient a question I had asked, what they had thought about something, because it assumed that there was someone there able to answer the question. The only thinking rational mind in the clinical room was mine. The form of interaction and supervisions made it very clear that the supervisor was the authority in the room, an authority granted to him by virtue of him being the supervisor, as well as by virtue of him being a psychoanalyst. I would now say that I was being indoctrinated into a very particular worldview, a view which situated me in a particular place in the world, a view which taught me to see the patient in a particular light, a view which indoctrinated me as to what was proper therapy and what was not. So over the 5 years I was with this person, I came increasingly to view my patients as fundamentally disturbed beings, beings that I had to think on behalf of, because their thinking was so distorted by their disturbances that it prevented them seeing reality. I came to believe that their disturbances were symptoms arising out of their attempts to avoid the darker, more difficult aspects of themselves and their lives. I was honed in the art of regularly interpreting good feelings and accomplishments as deflections and as flights from manifestations of hate, malice, envy, and the like. I became adept at constructing and delivering interpretations of this kind. I recall a group member saying to me in a plaintive voice, "Can we ever do anything right?" I was taught to think that frustrating the patient's wishes were in some way always beneficial. And this was most evident when someone who I'd been seeing 3 times a week for about 5 years wanted to reduce the frequency of our meetings. I was encouraged by my supervisor to resist her wish on the grounds that her wishing to reduce the frequency was a form of flight. She was avoiding facing up to the disturbing things that lurked in her murky depths. Well, what lessons can we draw from this sort of experience of supervision? One thing that is immediately clear are the power differentials in the room. Within this paradigm, there was nothing unethical about what took place. In the relationship between scientist and thing, the thing is simply an object studied. It is mute. It is not a subject that can actively contribute anything. The patient was thing to me, and I was thing to the supervisor. The patient needed to be told what the reality was by me, a reality that was told to me by the supervisor. There was no reciprocity or mutuality in any of this. Well, it was around this time that I parted ways with the supervisor and started in supervision with the group analyst, Dennis Brown. Very early in the piece, I proudly brought my psychoanalytic, interpretive acrobatics to supervision, acrobatics that I employed to undermine this patient's wish to reduce the frequency. Well, I was completely wrong-footed when, unlike my previous supervisor, he simply said, well, she's done a lot of good work with you over the years. It's no bad thing for her to want to reduce and even leave. I was disorientated. I continued to present material to Dennis Brown in the way that I'd been trained to do. In effect, I was hiding behind notes as I read them out. I was anxious and defensive, constantly presenting material in ways that I thought would be approved of. One day, Dennis Brown said to me in a frustrated tone, something like, "It makes it quite difficult to talk together if you keep reading your notes in this way." This then was the start of a different kind of supervisory journey, which can be characterized as me being helped to find the courage to make myself sufficiently vulnerable to be able to talk with my supervisor, not knowing where it would lead. Now, I'm going to take a step back and say something about how philosophers have thought about ethics and morals. So how does humanity decide what is good and what is bad? How is it decided what should go into the codes of conduct of our psychotherapy organizations? Well, in brief and in broad brushstrokes, Western philosophy has generated three distinct approaches to ethics. That is, three distinct rationales for deciding what is good and distinguishing it from what is bad. The first we have already met briefly, Kantian deontology. So the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant called on human beings to think for themselves and not uncritically obey the dictates of church and royalty. He also believed that by using this capacity to think, persons would be able to objectively distinguish right from wrong. Being objective, he thought that all rational agents would end up in agreement as to what was right and what is wrong, what is the moral life, in much the same way as all rational agents agree that 2 + 2 = 4. So, and in his view, because good and bad was objective, it could not vary from circumstance to circumstance. He called these categorical imperatives. Now, once these imperatives are arrived at, they are written into a rule book. And then it becomes one's moral duty to follow these rules, come what may. Deontology is the Greek term for duty. In the beginning, one uses one's capacity to think to arrive at the rules, but once arrived at, the rules should be followed, come what may. In a sense, it makes thinking redundant at this later stage. Moreover, and most importantly, the consequences of ethical acts should not have any influence on whether or not one does them. For example, one should always tell the truth in each and every circumstance, even if an innocent person would be injured by the telling of the truth. And one reason Kant thought this was because he said, if you did lie, you don't know what the consequences of the lie would be much further along the line. So consequences don't matter, you must always tell the truth. Now, the second school, consequentialism, reverses this idea. And they say, It is the consequences that follow out of an action that determines whether the action is good or not. And the best known version of consequentialism is utilitarianism and its principle of the greatest good for the greatest number. The consequentialists rely on calculations to decide between various possible actions one should follow. The third way of approaching ethics is called virtue ethics. Here, the sense of what is good and bad does not have to be rationally worked out, as with the deontologists, nor does it need to be calculated, as with the consequentialists. Rather, the sense of what is good and bad arises naturally from within persons because of their virtuous character. Certain things just feel right, and certain things just feel wrong. The suggestion here is that ethics and morals are innate to us, as is the capacity to act decently towards others. The register here is the emotional realm. We feel ethical distress. We feel disturbed when we think something bad is taking place or has taken place, and our disturbance is communicated through feelings. It is worth underlining the distinction between ethical dilemmas and ethical distress. Dilemmas have to do with the cognitive rational. Dilemmas can be worked out and worked through to a solution. Distress, meanwhile, has to do with the emotional. But this too is rational. There are reasons why one feels distressed. But these emotional reasons speak a different kind of language to that of cognitive, rational reasons. And this is exactly what Pascal's often repeated aphorism is pointing to, when he said that the heart has its reasons that reason cannot understand. So in contrast to this idea that humans have an innate capacity for concern, many psychoanalysts and philosophers, Melanie Klein and Thomas Hobbes amongst them, believe that at bottom, humans are driven by destructive hate. Hobbes thinks that humans have to be forced into behaving decently by the power of the Leviathan. Klein does allow goodness a presence at the beginnings of life, but only minimally, and thinks that morality is a later developmental achievement, an outcome of arriving in the depressive position. But there are other philosophers and psychoanalysts like Winnicott, Fairbairn, Raymond Gaita, who think that at bottom, humans are naturally loving beings who desire relatedness above and over all else. It seems to me that the supervisor I had spoken of, and the kinds of classical psychoanalysts I've been alluding to, subscribe not only to the darker vision of the human condition, but also think of themselves as detached scientists dispassionately delivering treatments. So I now come more directly to the subject of supervision. Now the subject of ethical issues in supervision is less interesting to me because it takes both ethics and the supervision process itself for granted, as though we know what each mean. This subject is an invitation to think about how the supervisory process might help resolve ethical dilemmas. For example, the therapist in supervision has discovered that their client's husband is a member of the same swimming group that the therapist in supervision belongs to. What should the therapist in supervision do? Now, whilst these sorts of issues are meaningful and worth attending to, they are mostly resolved by looking to the rules written into the codes of conduct. In a manner of speaking, dilemmas are easy to resolve. If the code says X and Y has occurred, then something unethical has transpired. If the codes are unclear about a particular dilemma, then more codes are written, codes that will pronounce on the dilemma. Right and wrong is being determined by referring to the rule book. The solution is a deontological one. Little or no thinking is required. Instead, what is being required is a form of compliance. The language that is used here tends to be that of boundaries and boundary breaking. Boundaries are also mostly spoken of in a taken for granted way, as though it is obvious what is and is not a boundary transgression, as though it is the case that boundary transgressions are always and necessarily wrong. For example, if the supervisee starts talking about their holiday or their marital difficulties in supervision, are they breaking a boundary? In the field of psychotherapy, notions of boundary are a code for ethics. To break a boundary is bad, to keep a boundary is good. So rather than ethics in supervision, I want to start at the other, to me, more interesting end and ask, who or what is the supervision process supervising? And even more fundamentally, what is supervision? Now, its Latin roots, which I'm sure are particularly familiar to you in Italy, super meaning above, and videre meaning vision, which when compounded come to mean observing from above. Is that what you think is happening when you are being supervised or when you are supervising, being observed from above? And more fundamentally, is that what you think should be happening? Now, the psychoanalyst supervisor I spoke of earlier clearly thought this to be the case. He also thought that this was the right way of doing things. In other words, within that paradigm, the form of supervision was ethical. And at that time, I too thought this to be the case. However, over the years, I've drifted from this way of thinking about things, into a more relational stance. But what does relational mean today, given that almost all schools of psychotherapy, including CBT, declare themselves to be relational? The question, though, is what kind of relations are we talking about? It would be true to say that as everything is related to everything else in one way or another, existence itself is relational. But what is the nature of the relation? The scientist looking at a bug through a microscope is also relating to it in the sense of observing it from above. Does the bug have a relationship to the scientist? The answer is no, at least not in the way the word relationship is usually understood. The forms of relatedness between scientist and bug are not mutual, nor are they reciprocal. The point I want to underline here is that notions of related and relating are not necessarily the same as relational, at least not in my understanding of the term. Further, reciprocity and mutuality are necessary and integral to my understanding of the term relational. So from this sort of relational vantage point, I think the way of proceeding in that supervision, the one I have been speaking about, was unethical, if only because there was nothing reciprocal or mutual about it. There are also other reasons to call it unethical, and these will become clearer as I go on. Now, what will an ethical supervisory process look like in a relational milieu? And I'll start with the training situation, with the supervisee in a psychotherapy training and the supervision being a part of that training. Now, as a supervisor, and me as supervisor in this context, in my view, my supervisory responsibilities require me to be, amongst other things, an educator, a mentor, a guide, and a teacher. But as you well know, there are different ways of being a teacher and different ways of teaching. There are dogmatic teachers who think that they have the knowledge, which they pour into passive, empty vessels called trainees. In my experience, these kind of top-down supervisors tend to be authoritarian. They have a very clear view of what is and is not the right way of doing things, and they insist that the supervisee follow their prescription of things. The power relations in this sort of circumstance renders the trainee exposed and vulnerable to the way that authority is exercised by the supervisor. A supervisor who will have the final word on whether the supervisee has gained enough to move on to independent practice. In this sort of milieu, there's a danger that supervision can become a policing and punitive activity. In my experience at the IGA London and elsewhere, I know of a number of instances in which the exercise of this kind of power by a supervisor has been extremely authoritarian and bordering on the persecutory. The supervisor says, "You have not done enough," and leaves the trainee in the dark as to quite what is enough and when it will be enough. And this sort of opaqueness is legitimated by a defensive use of notions of the analytic and the analytic attitude, as well as that of boundaries. Both can be used to keep the supervisee trainee in their place by keeping them in the dark. Now, although the group situation ameliorates the power of the supervisor to some degree, because there are others in the room, it does not do away with it. Whatever the other group members might think, the supervisor still has the final word. Further, the power relations mean that group members will be reluctant to voice opinions that are contrary to that of the training supervisor, particularly if the supervisor is authoritarian. But now, in the training situation, our not unreasonable expectation is that the supervisor will hopefully know more than the trainee, if only by virtue of being immersed in the field for a longer time than the novice. We call this being experienced. I said hopefully, because it is quite possible that, like King Lear, the supervisor might have become old without becoming wise. Said the fool to Lear, "Thou shouldst not have been old before thou hadst been wise." Paraphrasing Bion, Lear did not learn from experience. Now, the authoritarian supervisor amplifies the fact that they have more experience to construe of themselves as the expert who is full of knowledge, and the trainee as a novice who is empty. But of course, novices are not empty of experience. They come into trainings with prior life experiences as well as prior professional experiences. Just as an aside, training organizations habitually construe of the relationship between trainers and trainees as that between parents and children. Now, over the years, I've come across a number of psychotherapy trainings that have been explicit about wanting to dismantle the trainee's way of doing things in order for the trainee to take on the ways of thinking of the training institution. And rather troublingly, I recently came to hear of group analytic training supervisors in the UK who subscribe to this viewpoint. And I was astonished to hear this process being referred to as de-skilling, unskilling, and it being advocated as a good thing and necessary to the training process. To my mind, not only is this a form of indoctrination it is also a form of colonization. And most importantly, it fosters an attitude of uncritical thinking in the trainee. But what does the word expert actually mean? During the Middle Ages, an expert was a person become wise through experience. Notice the presence of these words, wise and experience. But a few centuries later, in 1825, when the notion of expert became established in law, a specific distinction was made between expert witnesses and ordinary witnesses. Now, in law and British law, ordinary witnesses can only testify to facts. What happened, right? The person got out of the car. Whilst experts, by virtue of their specially acquired knowledge, are allowed to testify in matters of opinion. They're allowed to have opinions about why the person got out of the car. Now, so here we have facts and opinions, and objectivity and subjectivity. But in effect, what is happening here is that the expert's subjective opinion, what they think, is not only granted the same status as an ordinary person's objective experience, it actually carries more weight. In actual fact, the expert's subjective opinion is a pronouncement on what is or is not objective reality. But paradoxically, being subjective, this opinion cannot be challenged by facts. And the ordinary person's opinion about the expert's opinion counts for nothing. It is only the opinion of another expert that is allowed to have any weight. Now, the terms expert and experience share the same etymological roots. And so the expert is expert precisely because of knowledge and wisdom gained through experience. And I have to say, allegedly. The opinions of experts are made out to be scientific and neutral, but of course they are not. In courts, experts voice opinions in accordance to the wishes of who it is that has employed them, whether it is defense or prosecution. Only recently, the medical expert Dr. Fowler, who was employed as an expert witness for the defense, that means for the police, in the case of the death of George Floyd, he testified that in his professional medical opinion, George Floyd did not die because of being choked to death by the policeman Derek Chauvin, but because of a sudden cardiac event caused by a previous underlying heart condition. So on this occasion, this opinion triggered outrage in the community of medical experts who called for an investigation into all the cases handled by Fowler. Interestingly, in a letter signed by 458 physicians, they said, and I'm quoting here, quote, "Our disagreement with Dr. Fowler is not a matter of opinion. Our disagreement with Dr. Fowler is a matter of ethics," unquote. Bizarrely, it seems that opinions have nothing to do with ethics. What we are witnessing here is the contradiction within the fact-value distinction being played out. There are objective facts, and then there are subjective values. Is opinion subjective, or as it appears to be here, an objective fact devoid of ethics? Well, the American police force is not unique. Similar things are taking place here in Britain and elsewhere. A recent newspaper headline reads, quote, 1,784 people have died in England and Wales after contact with the police since 1990. Yet, no officer has been held to account. Another quote, the UK has not seen a single successful prosecution for murder or manslaughter in relation to a death in police custody since 1969. Remarkably, in each and every case, the police have been found to be innocent, each time aided and abetted by neutral scientific expert testimony. But police forces are not unique either. All kinds of institutions habitually group defensively around the membership to protect them. To my mind, this is also the case with psychotherapy institutions, who also draw on their expert status defensively, particularly in relation to the trainee. Those in authority in the training body and the institution are the experts who grant themselves a right to pronounce subjective opinions as though they were facts about the states of minds of the non-experts who are called patients or trainees. We name these sorts of expert opinions in our field diagnoses. So when a trainee questions some opinion voiced by the training authorities, the trainee is readily categorized as having an unresolved Oedipal issue or something of this kind. In this way, the designated non-expert's disagreement with the expert's opinion is habitually dismissed as some version of resistance and denial. It never seems to occur to the authorities that it is they themselves who might have the authority issue, that it is they themselves that feel threatened, that it is they who are defensive, envious, and so on. In my experience, there is a tacit institutional agreement among designated experts that they will not challenge each other. As with the police, I know of no instance for psychotherapy institution having directly challenged or overturned the opinion about the trainee from one of its training supervisors or training analysts or readers of papers. I am sure there are instances where this has occurred, but they are hardly commonplace. I want now to say something about my evolving take on what an ethical supervision practice might look like. Recently, I was struck by a phrase that I stumbled across in another context. The phrase is prefigurative politics. Now, this was a term that was coined by somebody called Carl Boggs, and he took it. What he was saying was that the way a political struggle took place had to be congruent with the values of the society that the struggle was trying to achieve. For example, that one should not use violence as a means of achieving a peaceful society. The values of the struggle prefigure the values of the final state. Or to put it more plainly, the means should be consistent with the end. Now, it seemed to me that something of this prefigurative attitude ought to be intrinsic to ethical supervisory practice, in the sense that the supervisory process should embody and reflect the ethics and values of the psychotherapy process. The two should be congruent. Earlier, I had said that ethics modulates relations between persons. Now, what I take this to mean is that all human relations are ethically constituted in one way or another, including those between supervisor and supervisee, as well as psychotherapist and patient. This is a restatement of the thesis that I proposed in my Fuchs lecture, which was that the work of psychotherapy is in itself a work in ethics, that it is a moral endeavor. So in accordance with the principle of prefiguration, if psychotherapy is a moral endeavor, then so is supervision, or at least it ought to be. Or to put it the other way around, for supervision to be ethical, it needs to reflect the values of the kind of psychotherapy that is being supervised. Well, the authoritarian supervisory experience that I spoke of earlier was indeed prefigurative, in that the detached staccato interactions within the supervision echoed the supervisor's understanding of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Today, this is not the way I work, either as a psychotherapist nor as a supervisor. And I have come to think that that detached way of working, which requires the objectification of the other, is unethical precisely because it objectifies the other. So although this form of supervision complied with the requirements of prefiguration, it is not, in my opinion, ethical. Meanwhile, the work of supervisors who think of training supervision to be a de-skilling endeavor is neither prefigurative nor is it ethical. It is not prefigurative because the values of the supervisory process, de-skilling, run against the values of the psychotherapy being supervised. The supervisor is unlikely to require the psychotherapist to de-skill the patient, an idea that would be anathema to the values of psychotherapy. Just remember, in this context, de-skilling means to dismantle prior frameworks in order to make space for the correct frameworks, those of the supervisor. Clearly then, this kind of supervision is unethical, if only on the grounds that it does not comply with the requirements of prefiguration, but also on the grounds that the notion of de-skilling is itself unethical, because it does not respect nor engage with the experiences, views, and values that the supervisor brings into the training and into supervision. So what this shows is that whilst prefiguration is necessary to an ethical supervision process, it is not nearly sufficient. Something more, something else is required. But what? So having objected to the idea of de-skilling supervisees by likening it to colonization, the danger now is that any questioning of the supervisee's established worldview by the supervisor will be viewed and named as oppressive. This is not what I'm advocating. Surely it is necessary for the supervisor to view the supervisee's way of working in a critical light in order to help them see things differently. This, after all, is what supervision is supposed to be about. But it is also the case that the supervisee's established way of thinking will also, or could also, throw a critical light on the supervisors taken for granted, enabling the supervisor to see things anew. Earlier, I had said that in the training context, the supervisor also functions as an educator. And I flagged up the dangers of top-down authoritarian educative process, which takes education to be a pouring in of established knowledge into empty vessels. In contrast to the pouring in view of education, a more student-centered account conceives of education as drawing out latent knowledge already residing in the student. The pouring in model is conservative in that it seeks to preserve the sanctity of a knowledge base and mold the student in the image of the educator. Meanwhile, the drawing out model is more progressive in that it encourages questioning and allows for idiosyncrasies. However, in both, the movement of knowledge is linear on a one-way street, either from the teacher to the student or flowing out from the student. Further, in both, this knowledge is thought to pre-exist the encounter between teacher and student, either residing in a conscious form in the teacher, they know what they want to teach, or in a dormant form in the student. They don't know what they know. And it's the teacher's job to help them discover what they know. However, there is a third relational possibility, this being that knowledge is emergent and is being continually co-created in the encounter between supervisor and supervisee. This emergent knowledge is literally being created in the forge of the intersubjective encounter. Knowledge that was not known to any of the protagonists before, because it could not be known. And it could not be known because it didn't exist before. This, after all, is the meaning of the term co-created. In this process, the supervisor is being educated as much as the supervisee, albeit in different ways and different degrees. This, to my mind, is what an ethical supervision process should aspire to. It places reciprocity and mutuality at the center of the supervision process, a form of reciprocity that does not dissolve critical differences having to do with forms of knowledge and power relations into banalities by the device of saying different but equal. A form of reciprocity that recognizes the fact that each of the protagonists comes into the supervisory process with specific histories and specific investments, some of them in conflict with each other. A form of reciprocity that recognizes that the supervisor is likely to have more experience about a particular way of doing things than the supervisee, but allows these ways of thinking to be interrogated by the supervisee's experience that they come into the training with. A form of reciprocity that keeps in mind the ever-present power relations between supervisor and supervisee. For me, it is the presence of this kind of reciprocity and mutuality that makes this kind of supervision process an emergent and a relational one. And it is this that makes it ethical. Whilst in training, the supervision process is necessarily focused on the supervisee's work with a specific individual or a group. It is a learning process. And I've been arguing that it is a learning process for both supervisor and supervisee. More often than not, whilst in training, supervisions tend to be structured, with supervisors requiring the trainee to stay focused on the detail of what went on in the session by presenting written accounts of what went on. This is no bad thing. However, many supervisors, including the one I have mentioned previously, continue with this way of doing things, even with those who have been long qualified and become experienced psychotherapists in their own right. But not all supervisors proceed in this sort of structured way, even in the training milieu. For example, many years ago at the IJA London, the senior training group analyst Adele Mitwock ran her training supervision groups along the same principles as psychotherapy groups. It was an unstructured open space in which the supervisees, trainees, could bring whatever they wanted to engage or not with each other as they felt inclined. For her, the experience of being in the supervision group was in itself the supervision. Paraphrasing Fuchs, it was a form of supervision of those in the group, by the group, including the supervisor. The supervisory space created by her was prefigurative par excellence. Recently, I had an unusually awkward experience while supervising a very experienced colleague. It was unusual because things normally flowed between us. But this time I felt very disconnected from her and the material she was presenting. After a while, I said so. Following this, despite her being a little upset, things felt a bit better, for me at least. So when we talked about it in the following meeting, it became clear that it was the fact that she was reading her notes as a way of reporting the events of the session that I found so deadening. Reports as such are dead. Of course, I was complicit in co-creating the deadening process. I had become passive audience, a passivity which to some degree must have led to me becoming disconnected, lethargic, and bored. When I joined in, when I became more active by voicing my experience, our conversation started to become more alive, at least for me. Well, this must have been Dennis Brown's experience of me all those years ago, because this is exactly what I had been doing, reporting, not relating. It is commonplace to encourage those entering therapy to free associate, that they should feel to say whatever comes into their mind, whenever it comes into their mind, and so on. This invitation is based on the belief that these associations will eventually come to reveal important matters. I have come to think that something of this stance should also be the case in supervision. Here is the thing. At the height of my full-time practice, which included supervisees, individuals, and 3 psychotherapy groups, I would have been seeing more than 40 people a week. Now, what or who should I take to supervision? How do I choose? How defensive will be my choice? Clearly then, it is impossible to supervise the work of a full-time psychotherapist. There is just too much of it. So it cannot be the work that is being supervised. It just cannot be, because there's too much. So rather, I think that it is the person coming for supervision that is being attended to. Notice, I've just changed the language. I'm no longer speaking of supervising, rather, I'm speaking of attending to persons. This also changes the nature of what it is that I might be doing as supervisor. For one thing, it becomes more collegiate, and so less about policing the work of the supervisee and more about relating to the supervisee and their work. For some years, I've been in a peer supervision relationship with my colleague, David Lynn. At least that's how we started out. After a while, he suggested that we no longer call our meetings supervision and instead call it matters arising. This is the term that's often put at the end of agendas, matters arising, the afterthought. In other words, we should be free to speak about whatever comes to our mind in the belief that these are somehow things that matter. This was Adele Mitwock's belief too. And so this is how I've come to think of the supervision process in general. And this is the invitation that I now make who come into the supervision with me, that all and any matters that arise will be engaged with. So at the conclusion of this paper, I find that I've settled on the view that the 2 necessary conditions for ethical supervision are, first, that it ought to be relational, that it is constituted by reciprocity and mutuality. And second, that it also should be prefigurative. Also central to the supervision process, as with the psychotherapy process, are notions of emergence and co-creation. I should also add authenticity. I'll end with a thought about authority. Supervisors are delegated authority by the professional institution that they belong to, as well as by the supervisee. To my mind, the ethics of supervision decree that the supervisor uses authority judicially, lightly, and collegiately. As in therapy, key also are notions of sincerity and authenticity, a requirement for both supervisor and supervisee. And last, that the supervisors should be mindful of the ever-present danger of authority shape-shifting into dogmatic authoritarianism. Thanks. Over.